In the final desperate months of 1944 and the freezing dawn of 1945, a new and frantic front opened within the borders of the crumbling Third Reich. It was a front that involved no tanks, no artillery, and no infantry charges. Instead, it was fought with shredders, chemical baths, and most effectively fire. As the Allied juggernaut squeezed Germany from the west and the Soviet Red Army tore through the east, the high-ranking officials of the Nazi regime realized a terrifying truth. They were no longer fighting to win a war, they were fighting to survive the peace. The German war machine, famous for its obsessive, cold-blooded record-keeping, suddenly found itself being hunted by its own paperwork. For 12 years, the Reich had meticulously documented its crimes, from the industrial-scale slaughter in the concentration camps to the bureaucratic theft of Jewish property and the illegal execution of prisoners of war. Now those millions of pages of paper, the very proof of their 1,000-year legacy, had become a death warrant. This was not a spontaneous act of panic by low-level clerks. The Great Incineration was a deliberate, highly organized and state-mandated policy of archival erasure. It was the final strategic operation of the Nazi state, a massive project to delete history before the victors could read it. Across Berlin, Munich, and the occupied territories, the skyline was no longer defined by the flash of anti-aircraft guns, but by the steady, oily black smoke rising from the chimneys of government ministries and Gestapo headquarters. While German soldiers were being told to fight to the last man to save the fatherland, the men in the offices, the desk murderers, were busy feeding the furnaces. They understood that in the coming post-war world, a signed order was more dangerous than an empty Luger. They knew that if the Allied investigators found the paper trails linking specific names to specific atrocities, there would be no escape, no plausible deniability, and no future. The scale of this destruction is almost impossible to comprehend. We aren't talking about a few sensitive letters. We are talking about the systematic liquidation of entire departments of information. The Nazi state was a sprawling bureaucracy of terror, and every department, from the SS to the Wehrmacht High Command, had its own reasons to see their archives turned to ash. They were burning the lists of deportations, the reports of special treatments, the names of civilian collaborators, and the transcripts of brutal interrogations. They were attempting to create a vacuum of accountability, a world where the crimes occurred, but the criminals had no names. This first phase of the incineration was the beginning of a grand deception, a psychological maneuver designed to ensure that even if the Reich fell, the men who built it could disappear into the fog of a missing history. The fire was meant to cleanse the record, leaving behind a blank page where the bloodstains used to be. The documents being fed into the furnaces during the winter of 1945 were not merely generic paperwork or bureaucratic clutter. They were the DNA of the Nazi criminal enterprise. For over a decade, the Reich had operated on a foundation of absolute, obsessive documentation. Every train that moved toward the death camps had a manifest. Every execution had a written confirmation. Every stolen piece of art had a meticulous record of its origin. The first and most critical category targeted for destruction were the archives of the SS and the Gestapo. These files were the crown jewels of the prosecution. They contained the deportation lists that linked high-ranking officials to the final solution, the transcripts of interrogations conducted under enhanced conditions, and perhaps most terrifyingly for the survivors, the names of thousands of civilian collaborators across Europe. If these papers survived, they would provide a direct, unbreakable chain of command from Heinrich Himmler down to the lowliest guard, leaving no room for the excuse of only following orders. Parallel to the police files were the administrative records of the Nazi Party itself. These were the documents held by the Gauleiters, the regional dictators who controlled the German provinces with an iron fist. These archives contained the evidence of the internal terror, the reports on the repression of German citizens, the orders for the expropriation of Jewish-owned businesses, and the detailed records of the forced labor programs that fueled the German war economy. These papers proved that the Nazi Party was not just a political entity, but a predatory organization that had systematically cannibalized the wealth and lives of millions. In the eyes of the officials burning them, these records were a map to the gallows, They knew that if an Allied judge could see the correspondence between a Gauleiter and a factory owner regarding the utilization of slave labor, both men would face the noose. The fire was an attempt to turn a highly organized state crime back into a series of disconnected, unverifiable rumors. The third, and perhaps most strategically destroyed category, involved the sensitive military archives of the Wehrmacht. Following the war, a myth was carefully crafted that the German regular army was clean and uninvolved in the atrocities of the SS. This myth began with the fires of 1945. The High Command ordered the destruction of reports from the Eastern Front that detailed the cooperation between army units and the Einsatzgruppen death squads. They burned the orders for the execution of Soviet political commissars and the reports of mass retaliation against civilian villages. By turning these papers to ash, the generals were not just protecting themselves from immediate prosecution, they were protecting the honor of the military for the decades to come. They understood that without the paper proof of their complicity, they could claim they were merely soldiers, fighting a professional war, shifting all the moral weight of the Holocaust onto the SS. This massive effort of destruction represented a unique paradox of the Nazi mind. A culture that valued order and record-keeping above all else was forced to commit a frantic act of self-mutilation. The sheer volume of paper was so vast that standard furnaces were insufficient. In some cities, special outdoor burning zones were established, guarded by armed SS units, where mountains of folders were soaked in gasoline and set ablaze. The men throwing the files into the fire were often the same clerks who had spent years carefully filing them. As they watched the ink curl and blacken, they were witnessing the literal erasure of their life's work. But they did so with a sense of relief. They understood that every box of files consumed by the flames represented hundreds of witnesses who would now remain silent, and dozens of perpetrators who might now walk free in a post-war world that had no proof of what they had done. The destruction of the Reich's memory was not confined to a single office. It was a sprawling continental operation that mirrored the retreat of the German borders. The epicenter, however, remained Berlin. In the final weeks of April 1945, the administrative heart of the city, the Wilhelmstrasse, was transformed into a valley of smoke. Inside the Reich Chancellery, the Gestapo headquarters at Prince Albrechtstrasse, and the various ministries of the interior, officials were not just preparing for a final stand. They were conducting a frantic race against the approaching Soviet tanks. Eyewitness accounts from the period describe the courtyards of these massive buildings as being filled with permanent bonfires that burned day and night for over a week. Smoke from burning archives became so thick that it mingled with the fog of battle, creating a literal and figurative shroud over the capital. Even as the Red Army fought its way into the suburbs, the priority remained clear. The chimneys of the government buildings had to keep working until the very moment the first Soviet soldier entered the lobby. As the Allied pincer closed, the focus shifted to the Alpine fortress in the south. High-ranking Nazi officials, including many from the SS and the RSHA, Reich Security Main Office, fled toward Salzburg, Linz, and the mountain retreats of Berchtesgaden, bringing with them truckloads of the most sensitive, top-secret files. These were not just records, they were the personal insurance policies of the Nazi elite. However, as the American 7th Army and the 101st Airborne pushed into Austria, the order was given to liquidate these mobile archives. In the remote forests and mountain passes, entire convoys of trucks were doused in fuel and set ablaze. The Americans frequently encountered these smoking graveyards of paper, vast piles of charred documents that were still hot to the touch, containing the half-burnt remnants of the Reich's most secret correspondence. The goal was to ensure that by the time the Americans reached the final redoubts, there would be no paper trail left to follow. The most urgent and desperate incineration occurred at the sites of the greatest crimes, the concentration camps. As the Allied and Soviet forces drew within miles of Dachau, Buchenwald, and Sachsenhausen, the camp administrations initiated Action 1005, a process that included the exhumation of mass graves and the total destruction of the camp registries. The Kommandantur offices in these camps became scenes of frantic activity. The death books, the lists of arrivals, and the records of medical experiments were fed into the crematorium ovens alongside the victims. The Nazis were attempting to delete the identities of the murdered, turning millions of people into unpersons whose deaths could never be officially proven. In many cases, these fires were still burning when the liberators broke through the gates, providing a horrific visual testament to the regime's attempt to incinerate the evidence of its own inhumanity. The fourth layer of this geographic liquidation took place in the regional offices of the Gauleiters across Munich, Nuremberg, and the industrial Ruhr. In Munich, the Braun House, the spiritual headquarters of the Nazi Party, saw its massive central archive systematically dismantled. Local officials understood that while Berlin might fall, they had to live in these communities after the war. If the local records of civilian repression survived, they would be lynched by their own neighbors or hanged by the Allies. Consequently, every regional office became an incinerator. The Great Incineration was thus a decentralized total effort. From the largest ministry in Berlin to the smallest police station in an Austrian village, the order was the same. If it can be used against you, it must become smoke. This nationwide effort created a memory vacuum that the Allies would spend the next 8 decades trying to fill. The sheer physical labor required for this continental-scale burning is often overlooked. It required thousands of soldiers and clerks to spend their final hours of the war not at the front, but hauling heavy boxes of paper. In Berlin's Tiergarten, soldiers were seen using flamethrowers on stacks of documents that were too large to be burned in conventional stoves. The frantic nature of this work led to a surreal atmosphere of administrative suicide. As the world they had built was physically collapsing under Allied bombs, the Nazis were busy ensuring that the record of that world collapsed as well. They were not just burning paper, they were burning the future's ability to fully comprehend the depth of their depravity. Every flame in a camp oven or a ministry courtyard was a victory for the perpetrators, a successful attempt to steal the truth from the survivors and the historians who would follow. The systematic destruction of the Third Reich's archives was not a sudden impulse triggered by the fall of Berlin. It was a graduated, escalating process that mirrored the regime's loss of control over its own territory. The first significant spark of this archival panic occurred in July 1944, immediately following the failed assassination attempt on Adolf Hitler. As the Gestapo began its brutal purge of the July 20th conspirators, the Nazi leadership realized that internal dissent was as dangerous as the Allied armies. Local Gauleiters and SS commanders began quietly cleaning their files of any correspondence that might suggest a lack of loyalty or a connection to the resistance. However, more importantly, this was the moment the High Command realized that the sacred soil of the Reich was no longer inviolable. As the Red Army launched Operation Bagration in the east, the first local orders were issued to begin the evacuation and liquidation of sensitive frontline records, marking the transition from a state of total documentation to a state of total erasure. By the period of January to March 1945, the incineration shifted from a localized precaution to a systematic, state-mandated imperative. As the Vistula Oder offensive shattered the German lines in the east, the scorched earth policy, originally intended for bridges and factories, was officially extended to the bureaucracy. Heinrich Himmler issued directives that emphasized the need to leave no trace of the concentration camp administrations as they were evacuated. During these 3 months, the German railway system was clogged not just with troops, but with document trains heading toward the center of the Reich, where the papers could be destroyed in more secure facilities. This was the industrial phase of the burning, where the Nazi state utilized its remaining organizational power to ensure that the most incriminating evidence of the Holocaust was prioritized for the furnace. The clerks were no longer filing reports. They were working in shifts to ensure the chimneys never stopped smoking. The month of April 1945 represented the Great Collapse, the final and most chaotic phase of the incineration. By this point, all pretense of order had vanished. The destruction became a mass decentralized frenzy as the Allied and Soviet pincers met in the heart of Germany. This was the period of the bonfires of the ministries in Berlin. Every government department was acting independently to save its own skin. The sheer volume of paper being burned in the final 10 days of the war was so vast that it created a literal environmental hazard in the ruins of the capital. Documents that had been meticulously preserved for 12 years were being thrown from office windows into piles of burning tires in the streets. This wasn't just about saving the state anymore. It was about the individual survival of every secretary, officer, and administrator who had ever put a pen to a deportation list. In the final weeks and days before the unconditional surrender on May 8th, the incineration reached its most desperate and personal level. As the rat lines began to form for Nazis planning to escape to South America or hide in the German countryside, the destruction of personal identification files became paramount. The SS began burning its own personnel records to allow its members to blend into the civilian population or the ranks of the regular Wehrmacht. The Great Incineration had evolved from a strategic state policy into a desperate scramble for anonymity. The goal was to ensure that by the time the first Allied investigators sat down at a desk in a captured German office, they would find nothing but empty folders and cold ash. The Nazis understood that without a paper trail, the Allies would be forced to rely on witness testimony, which they believed would be easier to discredit or suppress in the years of chaos that would follow. The historical tragedy of this timeline is that the most critical window for the preservation of truth was lost in these final hours. The Nazis were often successful in their race against the clock. When the British and Americans entered cities like Munich or Hamburg, they found that the cleanup crews had been working until the very moment the tanks arrived. This timeline demonstrates that the Great Incineration was a calculated, multi-stage operation that allowed thousands of war criminals to slip through the fingers of justice. The fires were not just a sign of defeat, they were a final, successful act of war against the future. By managing the timeline of their own history's destruction, the Nazis ensured that the full extent of their crimes would remain partially shrouded in the smoke of 1945, leaving a fractured puzzle that historians are still trying to piece together today. The staggering scale and near-perfect synchronicity of the destruction of the German archives were not the result of mere coincidence or the isolated panic of low-level clerks. They were the direct output of cold, authoritative orders flowing from the very apex of the Nazi pyramid. The primary architect of this policy of administrative erasure was Heinrich Himmler, the Reichsführer SS. As the man who controlled the entire police apparatus and the vast constellation of concentration camps, Himmler possessed a hauntingly clear understanding that the documents under his jurisdiction were the irrefutable proof of a genocide without precedent. By late 1944, he issued rigid, top-secret directives ensuring that no records of special treatment or detailed prisoner registries could ever fall into Allied hands. Himmler was not merely attempting to save his own life. He was attempting to delete the very existence of the Holocaust from the official historical record, ordering SS officers to evacuate the camps, liquidate eyewitnesses, and above all, reduce to ash any paper that could link the central leadership to the industrial-scale slaughter. While Himmler focused on the machinery of terror, the Gauleiters, the regional dictators of the Nazi Party, acted like medieval lords within their own territories, ordering the wholesale burning of civilian and administrative archives. Many of these officials took matters into their own hands as they realized the central government in Berlin was becoming paralyzed and unable to protect them. They understood with chilling clarity that the records of Jewish property expropriation, the reports of brutal repression against German dissidents, and the evidence of direct collaboration with private industry for slave labor would serve as their own death sentences in the coming Allied war tribunals. By incinerating these files, the Gauleiters were proactively constructing their post-war defenses. The cynical claim that they knew nothing and were merely civilian administrators caught in a conflict they did not control. This destruction was a calculated act of self-preservation, ensuring that their specific crimes would be drowned in a sea of non-existent evidence. The role of the Wehrmacht High Command, OKW, in the burning of archives is perhaps the most strategically and politically calculated aspect of the entire operation. Unlike the SS, which operated in the shadows of state secrecy, the Wehrmacht possessed a centuries-old tradition of Prussian military professionalism that its generals were desperate to preserve for the post-war era. Under the direct orders of high-ranking officers, reports from the Eastern Front detailing the summary execution of prisoners of war and the direct enthusiastic cooperation with SS death squads were systematically fed into the flames. The objective was to fabricate the myth of the clean Wehrmacht, the idea that the regular German army fought an honorable, professional war and had no part in the regime's atrocities. By incinerating the orders for civilian reprisals and the records of logistic support for the Einsatzgruppen, the generals laid the foundations for a historical deception that would persist for decades. Beyond the supreme leadership, there was a specialized middle layer of bureaucrats, jurists, and administrative experts who understood perhaps better than anyone else that documents are more dangerous than weapons. These men, many of whom were trained lawyers, spent the final weeks of the war meticulously reviewing archives and selecting specifically those papers that proved the chain of command. They knew that Allied justice would seek evidence of intent and direct knowledge. Consequently, documents bearing the original signatures of Hitler, Göring, or Goebbels were prioritized for the furnace. This technical cleaning aimed to sever the legal link between the order given at the top and the crime committed on the ground. They were not just burning paper, they were systematically dismantling the legal architecture that would have allowed the Allies to prosecute the Nazi state as a singular, cohesive criminal organization. Ultimately, the real motivation behind these orders was not just the immediate fear of the gallows, but a profound grasp of the importance of the historical narrative. The Nazi leadership knew that if the archives survived, no one associated with the regime would survive the judgment of history or the courtrooms of the victors. They believed that without documentary proof, the testimonies of survivors could be dismissed by future generations as wartime exaggerations or Allied atrocity propaganda. The Great Incineration was thus the final battle of the Third Reich, a desperate attempt to win posterity through forced silence. By giving the order to burn, these men were ensuring that thousands of war criminals could, years later, live quiet lives as respectable citizens in West Germany or abroad, simply because the papers proving their direct complicity had been turned into oily black smoke over the courtyards of Berlin and Munich. As the walls of the Third Reich physically collapsed under the weight of Allied shells, a profound psychological shift occurred within the minds of the Nazi bureaucracy. They came to understand a terrifying reality. While a soldier could hide in the ruins and a civilian could blend into a crowd, a document was an immutable witness that could never be intimidated or silenced. Throughout the war, the Nazi state had been a polycratic nightmare of overlapping jurisdictions, where officials constantly sent memos to one another to protect their own power and justify their budgets. This culture of obsessive reporting had created a massive paper trail that detailed every facet of their crimes. By 1945, the officials realized that these very documents, the symbols of their once absolute authority, had been transformed into a meticulous map of the gallows. They understood that in a court of law, a signed requisition for Zyklon B or a report on the liquidation of a village was a more certain death sentence than any Allied bullet. The motivation for the Great Incineration was rooted in the realization that the victors would not just seek to defeat Germany, but to judge it. The Nazi elite were not uneducated men. Many were doctors, lawyers, and career civil servants who understood the mechanics of Western justice. They knew that the intent to commit a crime was a vital component of a legal conviction, and nothing proved intent better than a paper trail. If they could burn the orders, they could argue that the atrocities were the result of unauthorized excesses by low-level soldiers or the inevitable chaos of war. By turning the archives into ash, they were attempting to strip the Allied prosecutors of the smoking gun needed to prove a state-sponsored conspiracy. They were gambling that without the papers, the legal burden of proof would become an insurmountable obstacle for the Allies, allowing the perpetrators to disappear into the fog of history as mere bystanders. This fear was further amplified by the knowledge that the documents didn't just link individuals to crimes, but they linked the entire German establishment to the regime's depravity. The archives proved the complicity of major industrial corporations, the medical profession, the judiciary, and the academic elite. If the paper trails survived, it wouldn't just be the SS who went to trial, it would be the very foundations of German society. The men burning the files were often protecting their friends, their business partners, and the institutions they hoped would survive the war. They understood that if the archives survive, no one survives. This was not just an act of individual panic, but a collective effort to save the respectable face of Germany from the consequences of its 12-year descent into barbarism. The incineration was the final service they could perform for their class and their country, the gift of a blank historical record. Furthermore, there was a deep-seated belief among the Nazi leadership that witness testimony from survivors could be easily discredited if it wasn't backed by official documentation. They viewed the millions of Jews, Slavs, and political prisoners they had persecuted as subhumans, whose words would carry little weight in a formal legal setting compared to the official word of a German officer. By destroying the records of the camps and the deportation lists, they were essentially attempting to rob the survivors of their identities and their credibility. They believed that if the documents turned to smoke, the truth would become a matter of he said, she said, allowing the perpetrators to out-narrate their victims in the post-war world. The fire was an attempt to murder the truth a second time, ensuring that the victims would remain voiceless and the perpetrators could maintain their dignity through a total lack of evidence. Ultimately, the Great Incineration was the ultimate expression of the Nazi regime's contempt for truth. They had spent 12 years creating a world of lies and propaganda, and they intended to leave a world of silence behind them. They understood that the coming trials would not just be about punishment, but about establishing a historical record for the ages. By burning the archives, they were attempting to commit a final act of vandalism against time itself. They wanted to ensure that future historians would forever be left with gaps, missing names, and unanswered questions. The motivation was as much about the future as it was about the present. They wanted to deny the world the closure of a full confession. Every file that vanished into the chimney was a small victory in their war against accountability, a final strike against the very concept of justice that the Allies were bringing to the gates of Berlin. The most devastating consequence of the Great Incineration was not the loss of ink and paper, but the permanent erasure of millions of individual truths. When the fires consumed the registries of the concentration camps and the deportation lists of the Gestapo, they didn't just burn names, they burned the only physical evidence that millions of human beings had ever existed. This was the final stage of the Holocaust, the death of the memory of the death. Because these files were destroyed, thousands of families were left with a permanent gaping void where their history should have been. They would never know exactly which day their loved ones died, which officer signed the execution order, or where their remains were discarded. By turning these archives into ash, the Nazis successfully robbed the victims of their final right, the right to have their story told with the cold, undeniable authority of an official record. This memory vacuum remains one of the greatest crimes of the 20th century, a lingering shadow that continues to haunt the descendants of the survivors. Beyond the loss of victim identities, the incineration created a massive shield of silence that allowed tens of thousands of direct perpetrators to slip into the shadows of the post-war world. While the Nuremberg trials managed to convict the most high-profile leaders whose signatures were too widespread to be fully erased, the desk murderers and middle management executioners often escaped entirely. These were the men who managed the logistics of the trains, the doctors who selected prisoners for medical research, and the judges who legalized the repression. Because their specific orders and correspondence were burned in the courtyards of the regional Gauleiter offices, there was no smoking gun to present in a court of law. Thousands of men who had been instrumental in the machinery of death were able to return to their civilian lives, assuming new identities or simply claiming they were minor clerks with no knowledge of the larger plan. The fires of 1945 acted as a mass amnesty granted by the criminals to themselves. The loss of these archives also fundamentally distorted our understanding of the complicity of the German establishment. We will never fully know the extent to which private German corporations were involved in the exploitation of slave labor, because the internal correspondence between the companies and the SS was among the first to be prioritized for destruction. The clean Wehrmacht myth which persisted for over 50 years, was only possible because the military archives detailing the Army's role in the Eastern Front atrocities were systematically liquidated. If those papers had survived, the history of the 20th century would look very different. We would have a much clearer picture of how a modern, civilized society collapses into barbarism, and how every level of that society, from the university professor to the corporate board member, was integrated into the criminal enterprise. The incineration didn't just protect individuals, it protected the reputation of entire institutions that should have faced a total moral reckoning. Furthermore, the Great Incineration destroyed the narrative of intent that is so crucial for historical analysis. While we have enough surviving fragments to understand the what and the how of the Nazi crimes, the specific who and why are often buried in the ash. We are missing the private letters, the candid meeting minutes, and the informal notes that would have revealed the personal motivations and the internal power struggles of the Nazi elite. This has allowed revisionists and deniers to exploit the gaps in the record, claiming that because a specific written order from Hitler for the Holocaust hasn't been found, it must not have existed. The Nazis understood this perfectly. They knew that by destroying the evidence of the chain of command, they could create a permanent space for doubt. The fire was a strategic strike against the future's ability to reach a definitive moral and legal verdict on the Third Reich. The ultimate tragedy of the lost voices is that we are forced to reconstruct history from the fragments that the Nazis were too slow or too panicked to burn. Every name we know, every order we have recovered, and every survivor's testimony is a victory over the silence the Reich intended to impose. However, we must always remember that for every document we have, 10,000 others likely vanished in the chimneys of Berlin or the pits of the concentration camps. The Great Incineration was a success in its most horrific goal. It ensured that the full depth of the Nazi depravity would never be fully quantified. It left us with a fractured puzzle, a story told in shadows and whispers, where the most important witnesses, the documents themselves, were silenced forever. The smoke of 1945 did not just mark the end of a war, it marked the beginning of a permanent struggle to reclaim the truth from the ashes of a deliberate, state-sponsored oblivion. The Great Incineration of 1944 and 1945 stands as the final, most successful strategic operation of the Third Reich. It was not an act of surrender, but an act of transition, a bridge built of ash that allowed the perpetrators to cross from the collapse of their criminal state into the safety of the post-war world. As the fires died down in the ruins of Berlin and the Allied investigators began to sift through the cold stoves of the ministries, they realized the magnitude of the theft that had occurred. The Nazis had not just stolen the wealth and lives of millions, they had stolen the history of their crimes. This calculated panic ensured that the thousand-year Reich would leave behind a fractured legacy, a puzzle missing its most vital pieces. The smoke that rose over Germany in those final months was the physical manifestation of a regime that, even in death, refused to be held accountable, choosing instead to blind the future by destroying the light of the record. The long-term success of this archival liquidation is measured in the decades of organized silence that followed the war. Because the paper trails had been so thoroughly severed, thousands of men who had been instrumental in the Holocaust were able to integrate themselves into the fabric of the new West and East Germanys. They became judges, doctors, teachers, and politicians, their past successfully obscured by the fact that their personnel files and signed orders no longer existed. This created a profound moral crisis for the next generation of Germans, who grew up in a society where the perpetrators were invisible, hidden behind a wall of missing evidence. The incineration allowed for the birth of a collective amnesia, where the horrors of the past could be treated as abstract tragedies, rather than specific documented crimes committed by specific living people. The fire didn't just burn paper, it scorched the social contract of the post-war world. Furthermore, the destruction of the archives forced the world to rely on the luck of the survivor to piece together the truth. Historians have spent the last 80 years engaging in a form of forensic archaeology, searching for the fragments that the Nazis were too hurried to burn, the overlooked carbon copies, the forgotten files in regional basements, and the secret diaries of low-level clerks. These surviving documents are the only reason we have any measure of justice at all. However, the Great Incineration ensures that our understanding of the Nazi era will always be an incomplete picture. The gaps in the record have provided fertile ground for revisionists and deniers who weaponize the absence of evidence as evidence of absence. By managing their own disappearance, the Nazi elite ensured that the struggle for historical truth would be a permanent, uphill battle against the void they left behind. The ultimate lesson of the Great Incineration is a terrifying reminder of the power of the archive and the vulnerability of history. It proves that a state capable of industrial-scale murder is equally capable of industrial-scale erasure. The Nazis understood that the pen is indeed deadlier than the sword, and that the ultimate victory in war is not just controlling the territory, but controlling the memory of what happened on that territory. As we move further away from the living memory of the Second World War, the few documents that survived the flames become increasingly sacred. They are the only physical link we have to a truth that a genocidal regime tried to turn into smoke. We must view every surviving page as a miracle of history, a witness that escaped the furnace to tell a story that was meant to be silenced forever. In the end, the Germany of 1945 did not just try to survive the end of the war. It tried to survive the truth of what it had become. The Great Incineration was the regime's final confession of its own guilt, a frantic admission that its deeds were so horrific they could not exist in a world that possessed a memory. As we conclude this investigation, we are left with the image of the silent, oily smoke rising from the chimneys of a dying empire. That smoke was the last breath of the Third Reich, and it continues to cloud our vision today. The struggle to reclaim the lost voices from the ashes is not just a job for historians, it is a moral imperative for humanity. We must continue to dig through the silence, because the only way to truly defeat the Great Incineration is to ensure that the light of truth shines brighter than the fires that tried to consume it.